Hello, everybody. Welcome to our DevSecOps Concept Day. Patrick and I decided to get together and have a discussion around the concepts of Dev and Sec and Ops and base it around what we know about promise theory as a kind of a way of peering into the subject and getting a little deeper on it. So we're going to have a discussion from our homes here and invite you into our homes since we're all working from home, and hope you can join us.
Yeah, I found it fascinating, promise theory, the model, being now into DevSecOps, looking at this thing. And yeah, it's going to be great to have some structure to reason about the field. So I look forward to it.
Just our disclaimer, we never did this before, so we may screw up and make a lot of mistakes, but we're trying to do this in a totally online way so that we can invite as many of you that said you wanted to come as possible. So our thought is that we're going to do this as a kind of a podcast, and Patrick and I are going to fight in real time over these issues and try and make sure we tease out some of the main concepts here, and hopefully you'll follow up with your questions as well. So who are we? In case you don't know who we are, my name's Mark Burgess. I used to be in a former life professor of computer science at the University of Oslo, fully anointed. Now I'm sort of homeless individual roaming around doing consulting and advising, wrote some books, and many years ago came up with this notion of promise theory as a way of understanding how computers and people and systems in general interact with one another. And it's a way of thinking about it and modeling and being a bit precise about the issues. So that's me.
Yeah, it's funny when I see you waving your hands, I can see your enthusiasm, Mark. So that's cool. So yeah, I'm Patrick Debois, and currently I work at Sneak, but I've been following the DevOps space for about 10 years now. Co-authored the DevOps Handbook with Jim Kim and others. And I'm always looking for people who can put some structure in the madness of what we're trying to achieve as an industry. So I like Mark is one of the persons I look up to, to give me part of that structure, because I think it's important in just having these one-off thoughts, like, trying also to find a way how we can find the spots we aren't discussing and doing from there. So, that's, and, I like innovation. I like new things. I like exploring things. So that's how I am currently working in this DevSecOps space. I'm new to it in a way, that it's interesting to see the existing reasoning and look at like how does it work, like where does it fit. Let's explore that today.
And just for the record, you're enthusiastic too, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I have these little eyes that when they go like little small, then yeah, I get enthusiastic. So
good. Well, welcome everyone to our discussion, and we hope to entertain you as well as inform you throughout the day. So the plan we thought of was roughly like this: around a 6-hour session. That's quite long for an online meeting. And we're going to divide it up into 3 parts. The first part, we're going to talk about the Dev, Sec, and Ops pieces. In the second session, maybe try to focus a little bit about what is promise theory, how does that work, how do we apply that more specifically to this topic, looking at its principles. And then in the third session, we look at some patterns, because one of the interesting things to come out of this, I think, is patterns. and how we identify patterns and explore what they can tell us about systems and how they work. And then we'll tie it up with a summary towards the end, if you're still awake.
Let's hope they are, Mark, because otherwise it's just us talking. So,
all right, session number 1. This book that I'm showing you on this slide now was my bedtime reading version of promise theory, How to Think in Promises. And I use this phrase, thinking in promises, rather than the theory part, because it's really about, it's not about being super formal or anything, but it's about putting yourself in the frame of mind of using a promise rather than command and control and make it so, to talk about systems and the advantages that that may have versus perhaps the more traditional command and giving orders to teams. And this was tied into DevOps early on. And I think you're going to ask me more about this in a minute, Patrick. But this whole idea of the DevOps came from this notion that developers shouldn't simply command what changes are going to happen and then impose them upon others in a team, but try to work in a more collaborative way. And the way promise theory works is to try to break down any kind of system of people and places and things into actors or agents that can make promises, and how they then use those to communicate better and to interact with one another.
Yeah, it's interesting. This command and control in the past was also in the development teams. Here's the backlog. Do this waterfall method, and then people started doing Scrum. But what people didn't get is things like story points. The important was that we kind of give a good estimate on where this is going, but we have to realize we're in this complex system where it's really hard to make these promises to other things. And just adding into the slide on making it a human-tech relationship, I hold a lot of the DevOps Days events, and there's this tension between, it's like culture first and people first. But there's another group who says like, yeah, I do like my tools. I do want to work together. And I think the one influences the other in a way that, it is not only the people, it is also the people with the tools and how they react. I found an interesting example from John Ospaw that said, if you would do the thought experiment of you would not touch your system for a while, how long do you think the systems will survive without the human doing anything? Is that a day? Is it 3 days? Is it 5 days? So the exact number doesn't count. It's about the fact that it shows you at a certain point, if the human's not there, the system might break. So I found that interesting to see that the human is part of the system as much as the tech collaborating on these things.
And this was important to me way back in the 90s when I first started looking at human-computer systems. Some of you may know me from such movies as CF Engine with improvements.
Are they any good, these movies?
They're brilliant, but all autonomously controlled. I actually started a degree course at the university called Analytical Methods, and I wrote a book, which some of you may also remember, and it was called Human-Computer Networks, because I was seeking for a way to understand systems. And I realized that you actually cannot understand systems without including both humans and computers in the same model, because the computers don't really do anything without humans inputting something at some point. It might be the code, it might be the input, it might be user requests, and all of these things come together to actually steer and constrain the behavior of the mechanical parts of the system, the computing parts of the system. They are the biggest influence upon what happens in any system. You see this actually when you do monitoring. We were in Oslo, we were one of the first groups to measure internet traffic from web services. And you see these patterns of daily behavior going up and down throughout the week, peaks for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, very small compared to Monday and Tuesday. And you see this is exactly the pattern of human behavior, driving the traffic and the activity of the computer. So to try to imagine somehow that the programming is independent of what is going on in the human world is just a fantasy. And this comes back to us in many ways when we look to systems and their behaviors. quick reminder about why we care about theory, because for a lot of people, theory means something negative. It means not practice, and we should be doing practice, not just dreaming up theories. But for me, grew up as a theorist at university, was a physicist. For me, it's not about not being practical, because I always like to get my hands into the system and get those dirty to understand the theory. But it's about having principles to be able to frame consistent principles, so we have a consistent language for things which are impartial, so we don't, even when we get sort of excited and emotional about things, we can come back to these steady principles as charting a steady course through the discussion, and we don't kid ourselves guessing about stuff. We can come to this sort of calm state where we're in control. For me, what promise theory helps to do is to underline the role of different relationships between the system. So we talked about humans and computers, or humans and machine parts, human technology. And one of the fun things that came out of studying DevOps for me using promise theory was this notion of a downstream principle for responsibility. Who is actually responsible for stuff going on? And how do I point to that person or that thing or that entity when I feel like I really want to blame something? There's a great video which I saw yesterday, someone sent me, about our tendency to want to blame someone when something bad happens. And this woman's in the kitchen, she knocks a cup off the table and it smashes into a million pieces. And her first thought is, that's my husband made me do that because he polished the floor and made it slippery. And it just this balance, and it wasn't me in any way, it was somebody else. I think this tendency to want to blame somebody else when something happens is very strong within us. So to have an impartial way of seeing through that, understanding our system a little bit better, I think that's pretty valuable.
Yeah, it's interesting. Everybody wants to have on security saying it's a shared responsibility, and then in the end they want to hold somebody accountable for it. Yes. So it's like always this like dilemma of it's the group, but then we seek out the one scapegoat.
We tend to think in terms of obligations, that we should be able to demand something from people or oblige them to deliver on things. Whereas in fact, what came out of my work in promise theory was the opposite of that, which is that whenever we try to think in terms of demanding or obliging people or imposing upon others to fulfill the roles that we expect of them, expecting something, we tend to misunderstand the way the system works. Whereas if we instead turn it on its head, if instead we turn this on its head and try to frame it in terms of promises, what am I doing for you? Then systems start to make a lot more sense, because we understand exactly where the point of action is. Having a simple theory instead of principles helps to remind us to think in the right way when we start to get upset about our systems.
Yeah, and patterns. And we're not talking, this is the pattern to set up your CI pipeline. This is more about, all the collaboration happening. Even within the CI pipeline, there's a lot of collaboration happening there as well. So
once we've done something, we don't have to solve that problem again. We can learn from our mistakes or learn from our experiences and reuse that knowledge. Knowing when two situations are similar is the key to that. And also remembering our role of interactions to be cooperative. To when someone offers us something, will we accept it or will we throw it back in their faces? And this will help us to identify failure modes and other things. So we'll be coming back to all of these kind of ways of thinking. So let's analyze our assumptions about cooperation and try to dismantle some of this doctrine that we often hear about what we should or shouldn't do and who is accountable and so on, and just try to peel it back to a fresh approach and an open mind. We're going to use some exercises and we're going to be having our discussion like this, and we're going to try and figure out how to unpick incorrect assumptions, whether it's cooperation between people, between programs, services, microservices, macroservices, And we're going to try and use promise theory in some way without getting all super.
You kind of go outside of the group, take a little bit of distance, you use the whiteboard to kind of look at the model, and then you reason about the model and make it less like personal in a way that it's like A against B model, but you try to kind of come up with a common, not a common model, but a model you kind of agree on both, that this is kind of an interesting way of working on it. So it does bring up the whole discussion about repeatable patterns. Is it best practices? Is it good practices? Does it have like a certain context? I know people for, reusing the Spotify model over and over again, and then they kind of lack the context of applying a pattern. So yeah, that's always important to look at, whether it's applicable to your situation or not. But we'll try. I think we can be generic enough to kind of make people think about their situation anyways.
So first reminder from promise theory, a central message that goes throughout the whole. People see the system through their own eyes. Every part of the system sees the system around it through its own interfaces, if you like, whether that's your eyes, your hands, your ears, or an API if you're a computer program. And each point of view we call it an agent because it's a part of the system, and it has some agency associated with it, which might be decision-making capability in the case of humans, ability to perform some function as a proxy for human intent if you are a bit of machinery. So machines tend not to think for themselves, but they do enact processes and bits of behavior that came from some human brain in the first place, and they have an intention behind them. So an agent only promises its own behaviors, and it only has access to its own resources a priori, which means that it's limited by those behaviors and resources, that its capabilities, if you will, and that helps us to understand systems from a very unique point of view. I think it's really important with the discussion ongoing at the moment around microservices, how you reorganize teams away from perhaps many teams working on one monolithic product or project, to breaking it up into smaller modular parts where each group has responsibility for a piece, but none of those pieces on their own deliver the system outcome that we're looking for. It still requires some collaboration between them. So we have to understand now the system on several levels, from the viewpoint of each team, from each individual within the team, many different points of view. And all of these things influence the roles of DevOps and Sec in the system and how they have to think about ensuring that collaborative outcome.
So we judge ourselves by our intentions and other by their behaviors. And I think what it ties into the fact that you say an agent has a certain visibility inside of the system. We can't, up until now, read somebody else's head, right? So the intention is always conveyed by what we see from the others they are doing. I think that also ties into the fact that part of the CAMS model in DevOps is about sharing and making things visible for other people. I think it broadens up also the visibility on others' behaviors to get a better understanding what is happening, and hopefully by that we can kind of guess better the intentions, but we can't read the intentions right away.
So the second part of this that you mentioned in your talk as well was that we often assess people who are unknowns or unknown parts of a system to be less trustworthy than the parts that we're more familiar with.
If I use, for example, a tool that I haven't used before, I'm typically skeptical about it until I get more familiar with it. The same thing with people, although it depends a little bit whether you're a person who looks like optimistically to other people or more skeptical to other people. Sometimes we are triggered that we blindly trust that person. like somebody who, let's say there's a fire, you blindly trust another person you've never seen. So there is a little bit of vagueness, but in general, I would say, we kind of are skeptical from other people we don't know yet.
I think we see a pattern coming out of these topics, which is that trust actually is the common thread throughout each of these three components, dev, sec, and trust comes about from, because the unknown is less trustworthy, by implication, more known is more trustworthy. And so when you know something like a friend, when you have interacted with it over time for long enough to consider it to be your friend or your acquaintance, if you will, even if it's Emacs or VI or your favorite tool, you know this thing, you know how it works, how it doesn't work, when it's going to go wrong, when it's going to crash. We know when people are likely to keep their promises, when they're going to disappear for a coffee, and when we can rely on them, when we can't rely on them. That's when we trust someone, because our expectations of them are in line with their behaviors. When we don't trust people, it's because we don't know enough about them. So there's this link between our ability to keep promises or to deliver our outcomes, whether it's dev, ops, or sec, that is closely connected to this idea of trust and the predictability that we see in how others behave allows us to use them and interact with them in a more credible and trustworthy way. Even without any evidence whatsoever, we tend to form an opinion about kind of a default level of trust. And then as we get to know people over time, that assessment might go up or down, depending upon how they behave. And the key behaviors, I claim, are that whether or not people behave as advertised, whether or not they keep their promises, that's what tends to adjust our trust level up. Even if they say, I'm not coming to work tomorrow, I'm going to play football. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, if they stick to their word, if they keep their promises, we will tend to believe them about other things that they say. And that evidence, that evidential revision of our level of trust goes up or down depending on whether people actually behave as advertised. And I think that is why trust and relationships are intertwined through promises in this important way, which allows us to use this concept of formalizing promises to be a bit more precise and to measure a system in terms of what was intended and what actually happened.
Let's say a coder does a lot of work on making things secure that builds up kind of the trust from the security people while they're doing it. But it is a very tricky balance, because are they just trying to comply with the tests, or do they really care about the whole system? So there is this notion about like you can be doing the things you want, so be sincere, you can be like reliable, do it every time you do a commit, it's like runs the tests, but then it still doesn't build up the care, and the care is also part of making trust work in that perspective. So
the thing that stood out for me as I was working on this, and I discovered this work about trust and relationships going back to Robert Axelrod in the 1970s. He was a famous game theorist, studied game theory, and he looked at the interactions between the nuclear warring nations during the Cold War, and the trust that grew or diminished as a result of altercations between parties. If they kept their promises over time, trust would build. And if they were uncooperative and they failed to keep their commitments, there would often become a kind of a tit for tat response, which would lead to a downward spiral of trust. So the thing that I noticed in IT is that we tend to think very transactional because of the way computer science works, and we commit to transactions. We open a connection, we send a packet, we we click on a link, we process a form. Each one of these things we think of as a transactional process. And once it's finished, it's done, and that's it. The concept of an ongoing relationship is not something we tend to associate with IT. This is changing slightly now in the times of machine learning, but actually it's more important than that. And for me, when you guys came up with this notion of DevOps, it spoke to me about the non-transactionality of what we're doing, and that we need to have this longer memory of interaction between the parts of a system. So that shift from becoming very transactional to becoming more iterative and interactional, that more continuous delivery of stuff, that was the key for me to connecting these two stories together, getting from systems that just simply exchange stuff to making it exchanging regularly and over time learning and improving our opinions of one another and our capability to believe in an outcome.
So there's that makes me think that there's almost like a risk. Like we within DevOps or DevSecOps, we try to increase the interactions between the different groups, right? So the more points we get, the more we are able to get feedback and so on. But if there is no trust, the more feedback we get, the faster we actually gonna see there's a problem. And so yeah, so we become much faster aware of the situation.
We can't talk about trust without mentioning this famous Russian proverb, trust but verify. And security people love to throw this around. And what they're often saying, I believe, is that actually we shouldn't trust, we should anti-trust, we should always verify everything all of the time, because trusting is risky. And the counterpoint to that, I think, is that while trusting may be risky, verifying is expensive. So if we have to verify every single time we do something, then it adds a cost and a delay to the system, which may get in the way of being able to keep other promises. So when I used to teach security at the university, I always used to joke that the way we deal with trust, if you go imagine secure shell, you log on to a system, and the first question gets asked, danger, Will Robinson, never seen this IP address before, or this fingerprinted RSA key. Do you want to trust this, or do you want to be really, really cautious? And of course, being very risk aware and critical minded individuals, we go, yeah, whatever, we'll trust it. And then we're done, right? That's the end of verification. And once the keys have been exchanged, we believe we trust everything that happens thereafter. And from the perspective of trust as a human concept, this is nonsense. The fact that you said, yeah, whatever, I can't be bothered to think about this now, but I'm going to accept your key. The idea that you then are able to trust somebody more by having performed this simple transaction is utter nonsense. And yet this is the way we tend to think about trust in security, to simplify it into a transactional outcome. This isn't what trust is about. Trust is about a longer term relationship. Once you've exchanged your key, are my behaviors safe, or am I now trying to hack the system or do bad stuff? So for me, that this phrase is cute, but it's a bit of an oxymoron, and it's very overrated in security terms.
To your point of the cost of trust is high, I saw an example of if you need to have like meetings over meetings to decide whether something should happen or not, and you have that culture of, I would like to do A, I think it is totally the right thing, but I need to get approval for so many people before I do that, whether that's approval from, systems check or from people, building that is just very costly. But then on the flip side, you would say, act first, ask forgiveness later, but that feels really wrong for security people, because then the damage kind of has happened already. So how do you kind of go somewhere in between?
So the compromise we usually make is to try to grant permissions to enable certain to enable access to certain resources or to disable access to certain resources. So the key thing is how we describe or how we locate the resources or the services that we want people to be able to access, and whether or not we grant permission to those things. And the act of granting permission, we'll come back to talk about later, is a promise to say, you know, if I am in control of something that you need, I may grant you permission to access that thing, or I may not do so. Permissions, authorization, or access controls, basically, and trust are closely related, but the way we use them will be key. And those things are tied into specific promises that we make in different roles.
Yeah, it reminds me also of this saying, when you hire people, hire somebody who's smarter in a certain field, because then you can trust them in that field. And if you don't think they're smarter than you end up verifying them all the time. So it definitely helps to have people join you that you can just rely on it, because the cost of dealing and helping them all the time is pretty costly.
The counterpoint to that, of course, is that if somebody knows more about the money in your business than you do, you may trust them a bit too much and give them responsibility. I made that mistake in the past. But we come to these themes that are going to recur throughout the discussion today, and they are, you know, the who, the what, and the why, the how and the why, if you like. But the who are what we're going to formalize as agents of the system, who may be people or bits of technology, services, roles, and what kind of boundaries do they have around their resources? So are they an open book, or do they hide their resources internally? How do we get access to them? And then the what do they do? You know, what do they promise? What do they offer? And what will they accept from others? These two sides of promising. And conditional things, you know, what will I do for you if you do something for me? And this translates into the roles that are part of the title, you know, the dev, the sec, and the ops, development, operations, and security. What do they promise to do? What resources do they encapsulate, and what kind of boundaries do they place around them? So these things, I think, are going to be some of the themes we're talking about today.